Hello, everyone. My name is Ipsita Banerjee, and I am the National Training Coordinator with the Accelerating Clinical Trials ACT Consortium. Thank you so much for joining us for April's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Towards an Integrated Framework for Designing and Testing Interventions Targeting Physical Activity, Diet, and Other Health Risk Behaviors, Why Some Major Trials Have Failed and How We Can Do Better, presented by Dr. Simon Bacon, the lead of one of our clinical trials training platform partners, CBITN. Today's talk will be about 45 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. We encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box in your toolbar throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded. The Accelerating Clinical Trials ACT Consortium was funded by the CIHR Clinical Trials Fund and was established to facilitate, optimize, and accelerate the conduct, implementation, and result translation from high-quality, high-impact randomized controlled trials to improve health in Canada and around the world. ACT's governance model is composed of 22 committees and working groups, and today's webinar is brought to you by ACT's Training Committee. The ACT Coordination Centre is hosted at the Population Health Research Institute, PHRI, in Hamilton, Ontario, and therefore we wish to recognize and acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. This agreement was created to bind the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the Great Law of Peace. The dish represents the shared land, while one spoon reinforces the idea of sharing in peace. We hope to bring a similar spirit of collaboration to the work being done by the Canada-wide members of the ACT Consortium. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jean Bourbeau, one of the co-chairs of the ACT Training Committee, to introduce today's speaker.
Ipsita is coordinating the training committee at ACT. I'm co-chairing with Shrikant Bagdiwala, the training committee. It is welcome to everyone. It is my pleasure to present Dr. Simon Bacon, who is known by many of us. He's a PhD, has done mainly his research on the impact of health behavior and lifestyle, and on the development and progression of different chronic disease, okay, from obesity, cardiovascular, and COVID as well during the pandemic. He has really used a methodology that include epidemiology, psychophysiology, evidence synthesis, and behavioral trial design. Currently, he's an FRQS co-chair in AI and digital health for health behavior change, and also the chair of the CIHR SPORE in the Innovative Patient-Oriented Behavioral Clinical Trial. He's also a fellow of the Obesity Society, the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, and the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. He's at the faculty at the Concordia University, and he's co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Centre, and also researcher at the Centre intégré universitaire de santé et de services sociaux du Nord de l'île de Montréal, and co-lead, the International Behavioral Trial Network and the CIHR-funded Canadian Behavioral Intervention and Trial Network. Thank you very much, Simon.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being here, giving up your Monday lunchtime. I won't go over this. Is obviously what I'm going to be talking about. I'm really going to be, this is really very much a methods of how to develop and test behavior change interventions. Just make sure we can move. There we go. Fabulous. So I also want to just acknowledge as well that CBITN obviously is a pan-Canadian group. So we are on a number of different unceded Indigenous territories. I myself at the moment are in Tiohtià:ke, which most of you will know as Montreal, as part of the Kanikahani Nation. I want to acknowledge our ability to do the things that we do on these lands is a direct circumstance of sort of various policies of expulsion, assimilation of indigenous peoples, not only at the point of confederation, but still today, these things impact indigenous populations. And that it's contingent upon all of us to actually do more. And I'm very proud to say that CBITN has a very strong mandate around increasing the impacts, positive impacts for indigenous populations and indigenous peoples, and that we are very committed to amplifying their voices. These are my disclosures, none of which relate to this talk whatsoever. And today I've set myself some very lofty goals of hopefully by the end of this, you being able to detail some of the major limitations in some of the current behavior change intervention studies, at least describe one model that you could utilize, not the only model, but one model of generating and testing behavior change interventions. And then when you're reading the literature, I'm going to sort of highlight some key questions that you may want to pose of the literature to really sort of understand what's going on. Now, the first thing I want to do is really highlight what is behavioral science and behavioral medicine, because this is something I think a lot of people aren't always 100% clear of. So behavioral science is an intersectoral approach to the study of normal human behavior and decision making. This contrasts to clinical psychology, for example, which is really about dysfunctional behavior and behaviors that lead to dysfunction and of a particular note. And within behavioral science, it's a really very multidisciplinary, multi-perspective kind of science. It has obviously borne out psychology, but now many, many people from many different fields really doing behavioral science, even if they don't know it. I myself am not a psychologist. I like to highlight. And ultimately, the goal of behavioral science is to really understand and possibly change behaviors in multiple contexts. Behavioral medicine is actually where we specifically apply behavioral science to health. So normal human behaviors and decision makings in the context of health. What does that look like in reality? So for many of you, I'm sure your mind goes straight to things like physical activity, diet, and smoking, and other classic health behaviors that we see all the time. But it also encompasses things like healthcare behaviors, medication adherence, attending appointments, reporting symptoms. Another large area is around digital behaviors. So the actual action of logging on to an app, completing questionnaires within an app, engaging with the material, all of those behaviors, all of them are areas that behavioral science explores. And then finally, a piece, I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail, but we have got some work that's coming up that you might all be interested in if you're sort of very traditional trialists. But there's a whole series of trial behaviors that behavioral science can actually work to help with as well. So things like recruiting diverse populations, consistent intervention delivery, even in a drug trial, and retention of participants. All of those require people to do things. As soon as you have people doing things, behavioral science can help to make sure that we optimize that as much as possible. Okay, so the story today, funnily enough, I'm going to start with a drug, and this is more for contrasting purposes. But this is drug X. There's a prize for someone that can work out what drug X is at the end. But this is drug X. How do we go about going from drug X to implement it into clinical practice? Okay, so you've all seen this kind of picture before. This is the classic drug development pathway. You've got, 5 to 10,000 compounds going through all the processes, getting down to the one drug that ultimately makes it onto the market. Important to highlight, this takes 11 to 16 years roughly to go from idea to on the market. If you look at this, it's probably about $1.6 billion US to make that a reality. This is a line that I always like to highlight. If you actually look at the probability that any particular compound that you start with actually makes it to market, the probability of success of that one compound is 0.07%. which effectively means that everything we start with has about a 99.93% chance of failure. So more often than not, as we develop our fantastic drug intervention at the end, there's been a lot of failure along the way. Now, this is a single drug. And think about how complex a behavioral intervention is, behavior change intervention is, relative to a drug. I'm going to start here. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later on, but this is the point that's really important. So why do we need to do better with our behavioral interventions? Mostly because the literature is full of trials that have yielded very disappointing results. And also with positive results. And a lot of times we have no idea why, we have no understanding of what that means. And as I'll show you a little bit later, trying to implement them is another whole problematic area. But I'm just going to, these are some things, these are a little bit old, some of these, but these are just good examples of very large scale trials that sort of went nowhere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick on the Look Ahead trial. And for anyone who knows me, I like to pick on this one quite a lot. It was probably the largest behavior change trial that's actually been delivered, as I'm going to break down in a second. And for those that don't know, Look Ahead, this was a trial looking at a lifestyle behavior change, effectively focused intervention to reduce weight that then would reduce major adverse cardiovascular events in patients with overweight and type 2 diabetes, sorry. And as you can see, this was published in not a too bad journal, New England Journal of Medicine. So, that's not too bad. And so let's break this down very briefly. What was the Look Ahead? Look Ahead's like 5,000 individuals that are randomized 1-to-1 across 16 centers in the US. The intervention was an incredibly intense intervention focused on reducing calories, increasing physical activity, weekly counseling for the first 6 months, reduced afterwards, but still they have 10-year follow-up here. They would still have interventions across the entire 10 years, just got less and less over time. The comparison group is quite intense diabetes education, meeting 3 times a year for the first 4 years, and then still continuing to meet up to 10 years out. And their outcomes were 10-year MACE. And that's their definition of MACE. And there's a whole another conversation I could have about that, because some of that's a little bit odd as well, but that's what they had. Normally at this point, if we were doing this live, I'd try and get you to guess how much this cost. Remembering this is a publicly funded project, but as we don't have that capacity, I'll give you the punchline. There's $100 million. So without a shadow of a doubt, the most expensive behavior change intervention that's ever been delivered. $100 million of funding from the NIH. That's what we can track. They don't make it easy to follow, but there's that at least is how much was spent on this. So, expectation that this would, all pan out beautifully, and the results were very disappointing. Though, there's a little bit of divergence there. So if you blow it up, maybe, oh, no, nothing. Absolutely nothing going on there. Okay, so no difference between the intervention arm and the comparison arm in terms of reductions in MACE. Now, straight away, New England Journal of Medicine study, largest, most heavily funded behavior change study in the world. What kind of key messages do you think clinicians and policymakers take away from that? And then what kind of implications does that kind of study have in terms of uptake and implementation of this kind of intervention? Because one of the problems is that you do that one trial and it sort of clouds the view of the whole spectrum. And as you can imagine, most of this is not positive. And I've been very fortunate. I've was on the last diabetes guidelines group where there was some ridicule thrown in our behavioral science direction based on that particular study. But the question is, when you look at a null trial, what's actually going on there? Okay, is it truly a failure of the hypothesis, which it could well be? It's that behavior change focused weight loss interventions don't lead to reductions in MACE in these patients, or is it that this is actually a failure of the intervention? And what I'm going to show, hopefully, in the next few slides is it's more likely the latter than the former. Okay, this is an intervention problem. So I'm going to break that down just at the very high level. These were some of their two key targets. Now, weight is not a behavioral target. Just want to highlight weight is an outcome in the process. But for them, they talked about this as an intermediary behavioral target. And their target was a 7% decrease in weight from baseline versus control. The other target that was explicit in the protocol was 175 minutes of MVPA per week. And I won't get into why 175 and not 150, but it's just mostly historical and about the timing of when this study was launched. So if we look at that, so the 7% decrease in weight, this is actually the final 10-year result, and it's unsurprising. It's sort of that tick mark that we see all the time with studies that sort of target weight. Interestingly, as you get to the back end of the 10 years, you start to see this sort of downward slope a little bit. But that red line is the 7% mark. So on the face of it, you're kind of sitting there going, that's not too bad. That's pretty good. Except for then when you start to look at the control group, which actually lost a lot of weight as well, relatively. And so ultimately, this was not achieved. So their primary intermediate endpoint or a causal pathway point did not change to the level they expected. Okay, so not achieved. And this starts to raise issues about appropriate control group. Was this really the right thing to compare against? Certainly, it wasn't usual care in any way, shape, or form. It was quite an intensive intervention itself. And then let's look at physical activity. So I love this. This wasn't actually even reported in the study. So at 10 years, we do not know what happened with physical activity. But as with studies of this magnitude, there's lots and lots of papers that came out of Look Ahead. One of the early phase papers by Jessica Unick was one on physical activity. And they were just looking at the proportion of people that achieved physical activity up to 4 years out. Okay. And already, if you just look at this figure, it taps out at 35%. So right here, we're got a pretty good indicator that it wasn't particularly impressive. So 1 year, they'd only managed to get 30% of the intervention arm to get to target. By year 4, that had dropped to 18%. Of course, it's better than both instances, better than the comparison group. But also interestingly, they start with a group of people, 16% of whom are already at that target. So just to put that in context, right? This is an intervention that's specifically targeting physical activity. It's one of the cornerstones of the intervention. And yet, 15, 16% of people are already doing that. That's kind of like me giving smoking cessation to people that don't smoke, or me giving antihypertensive medication to people with normal blood pressure levels. None of that makes any sense to start with. And certainly doesn't make any sense in the context of a trial that's really trying to target physical activity. So dig a little bit deeper. So number one, on the sort of intermediary outcomes, they didn't get anywhere close to achieving anything that they were hoping to. When you actually look at the details here, I love this bit in yellow. The intervention is modeled on. When you look at the protocol paper, you get little more than that. But effectively, what this was the everything and the kitchen sink thrown in intervention. The last line there, the intervention utilized strategies have been shown to be most effective for long-term weight loss and weight loss maintenance. So they just bundled everything together and just put it out there. So interestingly, nowhere does it seem that this has ever been formally tested. And I just want to flag, once again, $100 million of public money. In my mind, I'm like, hey, just take 1% of that, just a small measly $1 million, and maybe do some testing of the intervention before you launch into this very large, expensive endeavor. What I do want to flag very briefly is obviously this is built off of the diabetes prevention program. And that's probably the greatest success. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But they've used this as a launch pad. They just added things on top of this and then hoped that it would work. So just a couple of quick slides about diabetes prevention programs. So once again, New England Journal of Medicine. Conversely, it's the same group of people that did look ahead at DPP. Conversely, this has been hailed as the greatest success in behavioral science and behavior change interventions. When you look, this was placebo versus metformin versus behavior change. Behavior change was so good, it was better than drug at preventing people who had effectively pre-diabetes developing diabetes. So fantastic. But a lot of it was very similar to what the look ahead intervention looked like. So the first thing that happens that once this gets published, everybody goes, wow, that's amazing. Let's do this. And then they start to go, but how? And what we've seen, there's been about 1,500 publications since DPP was published on DPP. Virtually all of them focused on, okay, so how do we put this into practice? And to this point in time, to my knowledge, no one has taken the DPP protocol and been able to actually put it into practice. And everybody's been scrambling to try and work out ways in which they can cookie cutter it to put it into practice. So just from these two pieces, the key elements that we have that are really problematic in our field, and I'm part of this field, so it's partly my fault as well. We have interventions that are poorly developed and interventions that aren't built for implementation. So even when we do have good quality outcomes and good quality studies, we don't know what to do with them. So what can we do about it? And so once again, this is just one example, one model, and it's the model I personally like to use, but it's not the only model. There's also the other famous one is the MRC model out of the UK, which is another development and testing model for behavioral interventions, behavior change interventions. But this is the one I prefer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this very briefly and go through the various different steps. But as you can see, just in general, it sort of follows the drug development, but with a little bit more sophistication. So I think there's some things that the drug development world could probably learn from this, to be honest, as well. At the core, though, before you even start to really develop your intervention, you really need to think about what the behavioral intervention cascade looks like. And I'm going to give you an example here, but it's really identifying the treatment, identifying what you're trying to target with that treatment. Does it change the behavioral risk factor? Does that lead to a biomedical risk factor? And does that lead to clinical outcomes? And mapping all of this out, it should be step number one before you do any kind of intervention testing. Very brief question to everybody on the line. Is exercise a behavioral intervention? I know we don't really have the capacity. I didn't put a poll in here because I didn't want to spend time doing the poll. But in your own mind, sit there and go, yes, no, decide. Because the answer is no. Exercise is not a behavioral intervention. Exercise is a behavior that you target with your behavior change intervention. So what then is a behavior change intervention? Well, at the core of it are behavior change techniques. And Susan Mickey has developed the behavior change taxonomy. This is the first version of it. There is actually an updated version, but it's sort of too big and complex. This is complex to highlight. The new version has even more complexity to it. And I know all of you have fantastic eyesight because a lot of you are a lot younger than I am. And so you can read all of that. Clearly not. So let me just blow up a little bit. So what is a behavior change technique? You can see here that there are some basic pieces. We have things like goal setting, action planning. Another example, which is one that we use quite often in the exercise world. So when we're targeting exercise as a behavior we want to change, we'll do things like behavioral practice and rehearsal. Have people come into a gym or into our lab spaces. We get them to practice the behavior, so sitting on a bike, cycling, or running on a treadmill. We get them to practice it, and then we ask them to go off and then repeat that outside of the lab space, as an example. But all of the actual intervention pieces, the treatment pieces, are all just a function of various BCTs that are clustered together rather than actually the target of the behavior, i.e. exercise or nutrition. Okay, so what does that look like? Let me use the example of MACE, weight loss for MACE. Obviously my behavioral treatment is going to be many, many components. So I'm just going to pull out these two components as an example. So we might do self-monitoring and we might have behavioral rehearsal. The self-monitoring is there because we want people to record intake and calories. So that's the behavioral treatment we're targeting. So the self-monitoring is technique. We're applying it to a specific behavior, record intake and calories. The behavioral rehearsal is there for us to be able to have people do pre-planned exercise. And then we want them to do that to a level that is going to shift our clinical outcomes, right? So, we have some indicator that reducing calories by 500 calories a day leads to, weight loss. Getting to 150 minutes of MVPA of aerobic exercise is a target we have in the guidelines. We probably don't need to actually get to that to have real benefit, but that's get another story. And we believe that if we do enough of these treatments, so enough BCTs, target enough behaviors, that we can shift our behavioral outcomes enough to actually translate to a biomedical risk factor change. So for example, 7% loss of body weight, which has been shown to have clinically significant importance. And then that unto itself will lead to a change in our ultimate clinical outcomes. Also acknowledging that these behavior changes will also have secondary effects as well. So it's not purely through the body weight, but this is our theoretical pathway. For all of you that have ever done an intervention that's targeted a behavior change, have you ever mapped it out like this? Because if not, I think there's a missed opportunity. So very briefly, I'm just going to walk through these sections quite fast, just because some of them are quite obvious, but some are more important than others. Starting with the clinically significant question and implementation science, which are always at the core, right? So what is actually the significant clinical question that you really need to ask? And how are you going to go about implementing it? Now, in fairness, for most of us, how do we build our interventions? Unfortunately, we use Slagiat. And for those that don't know what Slagiat is, it seemed like a good idea at a time. And I can promise you there are some things that are never a good idea. As someone that would never run a marathon, I can attest to that. How many times, I mean, I've done peer review for many, many years. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a grant that's kind of said, well, exercise is good for this population, therefore we're doing this phase 3 RCT of exercise in this population. That is literally the sole justification for the intervention. Peer mentoring worked in this population, and so we're just going to do peer mentoring in this population over here. That's it. Seemed like a good idea at the time. I'm a great believer in peer mentoring. I'm a great believer in exercise. Let me just apply it across the board. Okay. And that just really isn't how we should be doing our science. Really, what we need is to go back to basics, right? Equipoise. Equipoise is that there is genuine uncertainty in experimental medical community over whether a treatment will be beneficial or not. People that are sold on exercise is the benefit of all ills. Diet is the benefit, better diet is a benefit, it is the cornerstone of everything, etc., etc. That is not equipoise. We should only ever really do a clinical trial if there is meaningful uncertainty about the results. And that's tough for a lot of people, right? I mean, we obviously always go into our science thinking, yes, we have the solution. But actually what we really need to do is, as Linda Powell, who's a very good friend of mine and a great person that's been the cornerstone of developing the orbit model, be passionate about the question, don't be passionate about the answer. Okay, that's something you need to carry through. Critically, equipoise is the ethical foundation for trials. And when you look at pharmacological intervention trials, there's always this balance of pros and cons, risks and benefits, that when we get to trials targeting behavior change sort of seems to disappear. So what would be a significant clinical question? Okay, clearly something for which, for a problem for which a behavioral treatment or solution would work. So, for example, there's no current treatment for a specific condition. Current treatment is not potent or durable enough to change an important clinical outcome. Current treatment is effective, but adherence is too poor. Current treatment produces too many side effects for routine use in clinical practice. If there already exists high quality, good interventions, we don't need to intervene on top of that. And that's just true for everything. So that's the clinical question. The implementation science piece, this is fundamental. Start with the end in mind. Okay. If you really understand about where you're going, you're going to get there in a much more efficient way. And I would make a strong pitch here, and I think this is fundamental. And obviously in Canada, we're taking this on board a lot more. Fully engaging all of the end users, the key interests and affected parties is fundamental to this. And most of us focus on that patient and community piece, but I think critical as well is the healthcare professionals and the administrators. So we really understand what people can do, want to do that's going to be effective, but also thinking about the people who are going to deliver it or champion it or refer people to it. The healthcare professionals is fundamental. And thinking about who's going to pay for it. What matters to them? What defines success to them? What kind of structures actually can fit within the healthcare systems or community settings? Okay, these become fundamentally important, and they have to be active across the entire spectrum. And so developing a strong implementation science framework, good clinical significant question, is step number one. If you do not do those things in parallel, you are not building an intervention that's going to actually have impact. One little note about implementation of behavioral science. So the first thing I'll say is behavioral science did not develop implementation science, but I would say that over the last 5 to 10 years, the greatest advances in implementation science have come from behavioral scientists. And that is simply because when you look at implementing anything, you're asking humans to change a behavior, whether that be the individual, organizational, or population levels. So behaviors of managers, service commissioners and providers, admin support, technical support, policy, et cetera, these things need to change for things to be implemented. Hence why it's so important to have these individuals as part of the process from the very beginning. No one is a greater champion of an intervention than someone that's been in at the ground level of it. Practice only changes when people do things differently. Behavioral science. Okay, so moving on very briefly, we have this basic behavioral science element. This is a combination of theory and data. So we have some terrible theoretical models in behavior change, but we have some really good ones as well. So making sure you pick a good model. Theory is not enough. It never is. So you need theory plus some data. What kind of data? Well, we have behavior change data out of animal studies, imaging studies, epi data, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, qualitative studies. All of this is a hugely important, rich source of data that you need to have at the very beginning. That coupled with theory should be the fundamental pieces that start to get to you addressing your clinically significant question. Then we move on to define and refine. So in the define, mapping all of that out so that behavioral cascade is fundamental, trying to plug in the gaps around where the science is at, where the science is missing, and where you may need to add more pieces before you're ready to actually develop that intervention. Identifying participants, look ahead. I would argue got wrong participants. It was trying to change a behavior in people that were already doing the behavior. That makes no sense whatsoever. And a flag that we should be always assessing safety, tolerability, and acceptability at all levels at every moment. Once you've defined some elements, you want to think about refining, identifying, what components, what BCTs, what delivery mechanisms do you need to be combining to make this work? What kind of dose, delivery method, tailoring? This is, I come from an exercise world. So I'm in a department of kinesiology. This is something we do really badly. I see a ton of people who just develop these exercise-focused interventions, and it's 3 times a week, 1 hour at a time at this percentage VO2 max, etc., etc. And I'm like, why? Why that? Oh, well, that's what we did before. Okay, why that? Oh, well, that's what the cardiac rehab guidelines said. Okay, but that is not a good enough answer as to trying to get this moving forward, right? Test these things, ask these questions, have a sense of what you actually need to do to optimize the treatment. And there's a whole series of studies that you can do around this. Importantly, when you're looking at these define, refine elements, you really need to focus on the behavioral outcomes. What behavior you're trying to change and measuring that, critical. You do not need to worry about clinical outcomes. If you cannot change the behavior, it doesn't matter what it does to any clinical outcome down the line. Statistical significance is not important. It's been shown many, many times. It's the standard level of thinking. Okay, what you really need is a series of go, no go criteria, and they have to be built around the minimally clinically important difference in the behavior. How much do I need to shift this behavior to feel confident that this is going to have a health impact? And if you don't know the answer to that question, there's a point of study that you need to do straight away. If you don't know how much you need to shift your behavior, you're not ready to develop an intervention. You're not ready to do a trial. So you've done all the define, refine work, and then you're on to this phase 2 element. And in fairness, proof of concept studies, the vast majority of the literature in the behavioral science is a whole series of proof of concept studies. These are small scale, sometimes RCT, sometimes not RCT studies. They are bracketed around a whole series of things, pilot studies, et cetera, but they're not. They're proof of concept. They're effectively trying to determine a full treatment package, whether this can actually achieve clinically significant signal. And firstly, you need to should demonstrate it on the behavioral MCID, and then you could do some work on the clinical MCID later on. And I'm a huge advocate for proof of concepts being just the intervention itself to start with. And you don't need a lot of people. 20 people, you deliver the intervention package. Can you shift enough of those people to the MCID? If you can't, who cares about randomization at that point in time? If you don't have a signal that you can actually change behavior in the intervention group, what does it matter about what a control group or comparison group is doing? At some point in time, you may want to include a comparison group. Actually, just to even test the comparison group. This is another thing we don't do very well in our field, right? We just pick comparison groups because whatever. I remember we had a study funded very early in our career. We got heavily criticized by the peer review committee because we just had a usual care comparison group, and they're like, no, you need attention. So we went off and did the attention study, and then we got into it and we're like, why? Attention's a fundamental part of our main intervention. And now we're pitting it against a comparison group that's diluting the effect of what the intervention is. So what am I testing here? You could also look at just the question of the adequacy of the comparison group. How much does it impact the behavioral risk factor you're targeting? What kind of dropouts, crossovers, is it credible, acceptable, etc. Right? You want, when you get to the point of being ready to do a trial, you want to make sure that your intervention group and your comparison group are going to have as much retention as possible, because otherwise that's a threat to the internal validity of your trial. Through this process, you want to prepare the treatment manuals, procedures for fidelity monitoring. This is something we don't do very well either. Trying to package all of this in a very succinct way and being able to detail the key pieces out. So in theory, you could hand it over to someone else, and someone under your group could actually deliver the intervention. Quick comment about feasibility and pilot studies. This is another area where everyone in the trials field gets very muddled with this, and hopefully I'll have a small bit of clarity. Feasibility study is really asking Can a future trial be done? Should it be done? And if so, how? Pilot study is effectively the mini-me of a full trial. Okay, it's a sub-component of a feasibility study, but there's a lot of information you can capture in feasibility studies that doesn't require a pilot study. Distinction between the two I'll get to in a second. So what is the ultimate purpose of any feasibility study? Okay, it's designed to answer a specific question about the conduct of a trial. So you need to know what's your ultimate trial and what is the key questions you're trying to ask. It is not a standalone study. It's not something that's going to give you information unto itself. Okay, but it can ask you questions around process, resources, management, treatments, right? The delivery of all these pieces and whether you can actually then ultimately scale up and be able to do a full-scale trial. Pilot study specifically tests aspects related to randomization. That's really the main difference between a standard any kind of feasibility study and a pilot study, that randomization piece. So willingness to participate in comparison groups, unintended crossover, adherence and dropouts across both arms. Okay. Ultimately, this is as you would deliver a larger scale study, but just one step before it, just to make sure you are comfortable. Importantly, what pilot studies are not are less expensive ways to assess efficacy, a guarantee that a full study will be successful or positive, an effect size estimate for a full study, and that's a whole nother piece that I don't have time to talk about, but never ever take a pilot study, a very well structured pilot study, and say, well, you know, this point estimate's what I'm empowering my next study to. We know that that does not work and it will fail. Ultimately, there is just 4 outcomes that you will get from any feasibility and pilot study. Continue without modification, continue without modification but monitor closely, continue but modify protocol, and stop. Stopping is always a good option at any point in time. Finally, getting to the phase 2, 3, and phase 4 pieces, I think these are probably pretty evident. Phase 3 is the efficacy trial. If you have developed your intervention appropriately and properly up to that point in time, you're giving the best chance intervention the opportunity to be pitted against an appropriate comparison group. If it's a fully powered trial and it is null, it is most likely a failure of the hypothesis. Truly, the intervention does not do what it's supposed to do. Unless that is true, that's, you know, you can't really say that about this. Effectiveness trials are obviously then thinking about this working in the real world. And if you've done all the implementation stuff up front, the intervention that you have actually developed and tested should be able to move to effectiveness very, very quickly. There is also opportunities of sort of doing these quasi-efficacy effectiveness trials as well, if you've done the development work quite well. So here are the key questions. So this is my third objective. Whenever you read a study, first question is, was the intervention appropriately developed? Is there any talk about the development of it whatsoever? Any evidence that this has been evolved in an appropriate way? Is the intervention being delivered to the people who should be getting it? If you're targeting a behavior, recruiting people that do not have that behavior to start with. Is the behavioral target of the intervention being measured? Would you ever do a study on looking at MACE using an antihypertensive medication and never measure blood pressure through that process? Is the comparison group really appropriate? And this is actually fundamental, and this is something that we don't, you know, that is very specific to the field. Was the fidelity of the intervention is measured and reported? That is a whole kettle of fish there that we have to sort of work through. Last couple of slides. So if any of this was interesting and you want to learn some more, CBITN has a whole variety of resources that we are developing. They're going to hit the stage soon. So by September, there'll be stuff that you'll be able to access. In the meantime, we have our national conference, which is going to be tagged to the International Behavioral Trials Network conference, which will be here in Montreal next month, a couple of weeks away. If you aren't coming and you want to come, It's got a great event. We have some of the most amazing international speakers around behavioral intervention and trials development. From the learning objectives, these are the learning objectives. Key thing here, things do not change, we change. So if you want to do better, you've got to do things differently. And then finally, I just want to say a big shout out to the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Center, which allows me to do this amazing work for CBITN. These are all our funders and partners. And if you need anything, please reach out and contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. There are many challenges, okay, with behavioral intervention or non-drug intervention trial. And it's kind of depressing to see that the $100 million trial granted by the NIH, and I knew about this trial because I had one colleague in the state who was on the committee, of the NIH committee, and that didn't take all the attention and that this trial should have been put before putting forward, should have had all the science and the methodology that you have just developed and it's another challenge is that to get to that point of having this behavioral intervention, when you use the orbit model to mention that one, a lot of this research doesn't get much of the interest when it comes to publish this research, and that takes a very long time. I've done many of these trials, as you know, and I remember one international trial that we did called Comet. And if I counted the time that it took at least 8 years from developing the trial, getting the funding, having the publication at the end, and to end up with only 3 publications essentially, one on the methodology, one of the main publication, and one on the health economic evaluation. Then do you think, what is the problem? Because there is a consort, for example, that exists on that. Do you think the committee are prepared and the journal are prepared for these change? Because if journal don't do their job, or the committee, don't do their job, then those are probably the first one to educate. What do you think?
No, that's a series of great questions. I'll try and take the last couple in there. So the first thing I'll say, just more broadly about the spectrum of the work that needs to be done. I think one of the things that there is a feeling, it's long. Any study that's worth doing, any intervention study that's worth doing and doing well will take time. And there is, it's funny, I talk to people and they're like, oh my God, that's an entire career. If I start at the beginning and finish at the end, I mean, like it'd be one intervention that I've worked on and that'll be it. And my response to that is that, nowhere else in academia is it expected that the person that's doing the molecule development will be the one that does the phase 3 trial, right? So part of what we need to start thinking about is the team science, right? Who's doing which pieces, and making sure that we connect the dots on who's doing those pieces, so that we're running things in, some stuff in parallel. We're building off of work that's being done, and that we understand that my component of behavior change intervention trial development, or intervention development and testing, is this. I may not be the person that does the phase 3, but I'm doing really important work in phase 1, right? That I can hand off to people that are better placed to do in phase 2 or phase 3. So there's an important aspect of teamwork. Now, the other part, which is about the publishing and funding part, because I'll deal with these two together, I think it's really important. So the first thing is there has been a notable shift on the funding side of things. So I've done peer review at CIHR for many, many years. I remember the very early dark days is what I call them. And certainly in the, the psychosocial and the health services and so on, getting protocols that were absolutely slaughtered. Number one, getting protocols that were really poorly put together. It's like, exercise is great, do it for everyone, yay, was sort of the mantra. So seeing much, much more sophisticated studies where people have taken something like the orbit model and said, here's where we need to go, here's what we know so far, and here's the blank. My study is going to do phase 2A, phase 2B, and then it's going to pass on to this, right? And those things got funded because they had done such an amazing job of situating the ultimate question, where the science is at, what needs to be done now, so that we could do the good stuff later on. And if you and I honestly believe that if you write this appropriately, the peer review committees will get it, even in spite of the fact that a lot of them don't really know what the orbit model is or any kind of development model is, and they're all very quick to sort of want to jump to phase 3. So it's possible. The publishing side of it, we're quite lucky these days that the publishing landscape has exploded, not all positively, but there are now a number of venues. So there's, BMC has pilot and feasibility studies journal, which loves this stuff, this early phase pieces. We've had some stuff where we've published. We recently had a couple of papers published in the Health Psychology, which were effectively around some early phase work and really talking about the development process. So there's a little bit of both, and how we integrate, the end users and the interested and affected parties. So there's much more openness to publishing good quality science, even if it's of very small numbers. But once again, because it's all about situating it in a bigger context. If you just come with a study saying, we tested 20 people pre-post and this is what we found, like, no one's going to be interested in that. But if you then say, well, we did all this work ahead of time, we did this pilot study, it told us this, and that will then lead to X, journals are much more open to that.
Those are very good advice. There are 2 questions that I'm going to mention. Those are very good advice, Simon. And just for people to know that the science of behavior and how to test it may not be new, but the extended consort is relatively new. The first one was in 2008. Then now there is no reason, not to do it right. But your advice are very practical. There are 2 questions. There is one question by Diana Sherifali. If you could redo the physical activity component of look ahead, how would you implement, monitor, and evaluate that component, recognizing the limitation already of the active population? Then implement, monitor, and evaluate that component of the physical activity intervention.
If I had a really rock solid answer to
$200 million. $200 million.
Exactly. If I had the rock solid answer, there's probably a Nobel Prize right there, because I think that's the ultimate question that we're all trying to answer. My philosophy around how to develop interventions, I've gone really back to a lot of basics, right? So I need to understand the population. And this sort of applies a little bit to the second question as well. I think our cookie cutter mentality to creating interventions and just delivering them is just bad science. And it leads us down these paths where we don't understand what's happening. We don't understand why people are doing things, why people aren't doing things. I think you have to take it all the way back. And I'll give you a very good example. In our lab, we're very interested in bariatric surgery and developing adjunct behavior change interventions for bariatric surgery. We've started with qualitative work, asking people, what do they want? Healthcare practitioners, what will what can you actually implement? The administrators, what will you pay for? And how can we integrate it into services and so on? And we're building from the ground up because we just have no clue. This is a very specific population that have very specific needs. And nothing that we've really done up to this point in time has really said, well, what are those needs? Both in terms of physical activity, dietary change, and eating behaviors. And so I think if we're always constantly looking for the quick fix on this, we won't ever actually move forward. We'll just have a lot of noise that keeps getting generated. So my answer to sort of a lot of this is you take a step back, and maybe you do. Good news is in diabetes, for example, there's now a lot of literature around physical activity in diabetes. So number one, you can start with looking at what's working, what's not working, what can we glean, what do we understand, and then start doing some smaller scale stuff, which you can do relatively quickly, that potentially you could start scaling up in terms of moving to an intervention faster.
Another question, thanks, into exercise intervention here that lead to a better long-term exercise adherence. Okay, what element can be incorporated? Sounds like this would be good for all of us, not only for a study here, then for the long term now.
Right. So at the core of this, the simplest answer I can give, because there's no complete answer to this. So where we always start with any intervention is asking the fundamental question of the individual: why? What in your life is going to be better if you change this behavior? That's the fundamental question. Because the individual has to identify their key driver. And that's the thing that they have to hold on to. What's interesting is when you do that and you ask that, I can almost guarantee you that sort of 95% of the time it is not going to be health. Yet we as healthcare practitioners, what do we always do? Well, you need to exercise more because, if you don't, you're going to have a heart attack. If you don't, you're going to get diabetes. If you don't, health. So we're good at sort of like pushing that on people. Reality is most people want to exercise for other things. They want to be functional. I want to play with my grandkids. I want to be able to go shopping and be able to put my shopping away without any pain. I want to be able to walk up the stairs and not be out of breath. These are the things that motivate people, and these are the anchors that really have to be at the corner of why someone will engage in a behavior and maintain that behavior over the long term. So ultimately, there isn't any magic bullet that I have other than to make sure that when I'm developing interventions or delivering an intervention to an individual, that they are at the center of that intervention and that they are the ones that are driving the why.
Yeah.
Because once they understand the why, I can start giving them some tools to help them to get there.
That's what they call the intrinsic motivation, okay? And the pedometer may not be the intrinsic motivation, but a mean to reach your own personal goal. Last question, what are you taught on the creating change now for behavior change intervention that are already been done, like research in phase 2 or 3? Do you think that in order to improve behavioral intervention, we have to start a more thoughtful approach at phase 1 of development?
Simple answer to that is yes. I think, there is a lot of work that's been done. I will say that most of it is pretty low quality. Certainly the reporting on interventions is of a lower quality than the actual work itself. And that becomes really difficult to then be able to take anything that's in the literature and say, okay, I'm going to use this as a basis to then start developing something new. Because a lot of the time we have no idea what people are actually done in an intervention. But if there's evidence out there, always start with what evidence is available. Then you leverage that to really think about, do I understand within this intervention what's working, what's not working? Can I even describe this intervention? You've got to get a little bit uncomfortable in terms of going into some of the other literatures to really pulling apart, what are the various pieces that are already out there? I'm not a big fan of animal work. I've never worked with animals, and I've got a question how much of that translates across. That being said, there are some signals in the animal literature that you can say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's important I need to incorporate. Epidemiological data gives us huge signals about how things are related to each other and how moving parts of it. So I think you always start with as much evidence as possible, take what people have already done, identify things that work, things that don't seem to work, and then try and be sophisticated about putting that together to start moving the process forward.
Thank you very much, Simon. Those are really eyes-opening, okay, on this important research that need to be done the right way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bacon, for your amazing presentation. I think you've provided us with lots of ideas to think about the numerous ways that we can consider behavior at multiple stages of trial development and execution. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.